Evening, everybody. This session is being recorded, just so you know. Welcome to this launch event of the book, Reimagining Civil Society Collaborations in Development, starting from the South. My name is Alexander Medic. I work at Partos, and I will be the host for today's exciting event. And for those who don't know us, Partos is the Association for Dutch Development Organizations. And for multiple years, Partos has actively supported the Shift to Power movement, pushing for more equal power relationships within development cooperation. Unbalanced and misused power remains a major challenge for development cooperation, and is also often a root cause of poverty, inequality, exclusion, mismanagement of national resources, and conflicts. In this respect, our pursuit of broader systems change is only credible if our own activities, behavior, partnerships, our thoughts, reflect an appropriate and fairly shared balance of power. And this book is fundamental in pushing us towards the right direction. In the next 1 hour and a half, we'll be hearing from Margit, Justice, Njeri, Catherine, Temrais, Aval, Marijke, and Wasima, who will be giving us an overview of the book and share some insights and critical perspectives as well. We will have some time for Q&A, ample time actually, so feel free to ask questions that you have about the book or something related in the chat. By the way, did you know that the book can be downloaded for free? Also, that link is going to be put in the chat. So before I will give the word to Margit and Justice, I would like to share a poem with you. In Georgia, where I was born, we share poems on special occasions. And as I am not a poet, as some of you might know, I've asked my good friend Artificial Intelligence to create, or actually co-create, a poem for and about the book. So there it is. Civil society collaborations, a subject of debate. From the South we start to reimagine and create concepts and reflections from various fields we observe, starting from local context, empowering from the grassroots curve. Funds controlled by few from global north to south. Localization as the goal, equal partnerships, no doubt. Transformation, the aim, for CSOs and wide. To lead and take control with systems change inside. Collaboration, that is key for a better world to unfold. Let's work together and see the power of stories untold. So today we are going to hear some beautiful stories. And now, without further ado, I would like to give the word to Professor Margit van Wessel and Justice Bavoler, 2 of the 3 main editors of the book. Enjoy the ride and enjoy the stories.
Well, thanks so much, Alex, for this wonderful introduction and the poem. Very special and much appreciated. Thanks also everybody for being here. It's really exciting to share our book with you. So we have a program where we're going to have a brief introduction of the book on the whole to start with. And I'm going to share that with some contributions from Justice at the end. And then we move on to the different chapters that illustrate more going into different aspects of the book, different perspectives that we have there. So thanks so much also for the authors. So I am Margit van Wessel. I work at Wageningen University in the Netherlands. Justice, can you say a few words about yourself?
Yes, my name is Justice Baole. I'm a professor of public administration and management and currently the dean of the University of Ghana Business School in Ghana. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice. So Justice was co-editor of the book together with me, and also Tina Kontinen was editor of the book, and she is not speaking today, but fortunately I could see she's also present in the audience. So very great to have her with us as an editor and in the audience today. So I will just start with a brief presentation about the book on the whole. So reimagining civil society collaborations in development starting from the South. So there's 2 key ideas here, the reimagining and the starting from the South. And I'm going into some of that as we move forward. Let me just try and move forward here. So the book came out last month. So it's really fresh. It's open access, as was told, which is also very special. And we thought that this was really important, given that we want this to be available globally. It has a lot of different contributions from different corners of the world. We have 22 chapters and 40 contributors, many of whom are from the Global South. There's a lot of co-production also with the Global South, with actors situated in the Global South or from the Global South. And we think it's really important that this book also helps to bring forward contributions from the Global South. So I think that's also one of the reasons why the book has the message that it has. And this message is about reimagining, and reimagining because if you imagine how things can be different, what a different situation could look like, it becomes more possible to actually make change because you have an alternative reality that you can work towards. So rather than more attention to funding and power as such, the offering of different ways of working and different ways of thinking about working together was what we try to bring forward here. And then there's the idea of starting from the South. And this starting from the South, there's really one basic concept, I think, which is central to this whole idea, and that's recognition. Recognition of what's possible if you start out from the perspective and possibilities and capacities and priorities of Southern-based civil society organizations. And that often remains invisible what these are. They are not prioritized and they're often also not exactly seen, let alone as a starting point. And what you really see across the chapters is a crying out, so to say, of see us, see what we are capable of, see why it is justified that we should be in the lead. It's not just something that should happen, but it's something that can happen because we are equipped to do that. So it's really about recognition of the validity and importance and possibilities of Southern civil society organizations working within their context and being driven by the possibilities they have in that context. So it's not really just about power. Power is talked about all the time in the context of shifting power, locally led development, localization, and the rest of it. But this is not just about power. This is about building a new foundation. And it moves beyond power in the sense that, well, many current initiatives, they try to give power. They seek to give power within an established context, giving up some control, like creating more inclusive decision-making processes or capacity strengthening or stimulating Southern controlled initiatives. But it's still very much often maintaining existing structures in the sense that, for example, international civil society programs are defined by INGO and donors, and within such a program then control is shifted, so to say, over decision making and over and funding is still being controlled a lot by northern actors. So it maintains these structures, and what this book tries to do is offer possibilities of rethinking at a more systemic level, so rethinking the starting points of collaboration, and then aiming to make that happen by offering alternatives. So it's about reimagining collaborations in the sense of who can be what to whom, rather than moving power from one side to the next. And thereby we also try to offer a viable and attractive alternative way of thinking about INGO and donor roles, because it's not about giving up or ridiculing or stigmatizing the power of the global north. I think that would be a big mistake. It's about recentering collaboration. So you start out from Southern settings and program development is turned upside down. This is then about recognition of Southern CSOs as experts within their own context. They can create change in that context, and they do that from their own understandings and their priorities and possibilities and the local legitimacy that they have and their the networks that they have. They are the ones having multiplicity of relations that can be starting points, and starting from that, then INGOs and Northern CSOs can support that, and they can be legitimate in that, in their added value to Southern-centered efforts. So we have 5 sections in the book, and each of these recenters civil society collaborations in the Global South from from a certain perspective. And these perspectives came about by the contributions of the authors. We sent out a call for chapters, a call for proposals, and we got a whole lot of chapters coming in that for us defined also what starting from the South could mean. So that's where these different sections come from. So 19 chapters all in all, divided over 5 sections, each having these themes. That was really emerging from what came to us. And the first section is then reclaiming the lead. So it's about how Southern organizations are in a position to lead, mobilizing their knowledge, mobilizing their capacities, working with perspectives that they have, and showing how Southern leadership is actually a possibility and a justified possibility. And the second section is displacing the North-South diet. We tend to think in the development sector a lot in North-South relations, very linearly defined. But if you look beyond that, Southern CSO's work is defined by lots of collaborations, lots of different types of relations that come in. And we need to understand development work and civil society work as set in a multiplicity of relations rather than just this North-South diet. So it's about creating a new understanding of what relations can matter. And then asking Southern-centered questions, that's really about how, if you look closely to the work of Southern civil society organizations, you can see that different questions emerge for them than what we usually ask in the development sector. Lots of our discussions are framed in internationally defined terms, but once you look more in the global South, you can see that different types of questions come up. For example, how NGOs can support social movements within a certain domestic context. That's a question, for example, that comes up in one of those chapters, and there's multiple examples like that. So if you are more open about the questions that matter, Southern-centered questions come up. The fourth section is learning new roles for the North. So if you start out from the South, that means that new roles need to develop for the global North. And the book gives a number of ways in which that can happen and new roles that can come about if you start from the South. The fifth section then is about new different principles and approaches for collaborations rather than the aid sector conditions that shape a lot of the collaboration, like accountability mechanisms and contracts and things like that, and theories of change. Here you have a recognition of lived experience, informality, and acceptance of the role of trust, for example. So these are different entry points for reimagining. And in the following section, we're going to have a few examples of chapters in the different sections. So we have Njeri, who's going to talk about a form of reclaiming the lead. We have Temris, who's going to zoom in on Southern-centered questions. And we have Marijke and Awal talking about learning new roles for the North, or at least their chapters fit in that section. So that's also give you a better taste for what the different chapters are actually about. And then afterwards, I'm going to, together also with Justice, we're going to talk a little bit about, if you look through the book on the whole, what are the main conclusions? But that's for more at the end of our session today. So before we move forward to the presentations, Justice, do you want to add something to what I said?
Thank you, Margaret. You have so excellently delivered, and just not a lot to add at this stage, but just to say, reiterate the point about reimagining the possibilities that can occur when we reimagine. The fact that there are many things that we could actually discover and be able to work together on when we reimagine. And what the book seeks to do is to create examples of these, but also to say that there are limitless possibilities of new ways of doing things when we reimagine and we interrogate what we currently do. And that's what the book has been seeking to do. And you have done that, giving us a great summary of the content of the book. I think I'll leave it here so that we can have more time for others to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Justice, also for your kind words. So let's give the floor then to Njeri, who's going to talk about reimagining development from local voices and positions. Please, Njeri, take the floor, and I'll just stop sharing here.
Thank you. So welcome everybody, excited to have you with us. So kindly, humbly allow me to share my screen. Share. Oh, I went to the wrong side of sharing. Sorry about that. Yeah, so who is Njeri Kimotho, the lady in front of your screen? So Njeri is actually described more or less through that infographic. Personally, I love colors, so I also know that I love representing myself in different dimensions. So Njeri is an intersectional self. I can define myself in so very many layers, multiple intersecting layers. But for purposes of today, Njeri is a co-author in the book. And I have co-authored together with Catherine, Dr. Catherine Odenyo, and Yana. I think I saw Yana enter the room. Dr. Catherine, I think she'll be joining us, or if she's in the room, she's part of this journey, and we co-created this book chapter on the basis that we are Southern-based feminists. So what you see being echoed or coming out of our book chapter is actually a lived experience as not only feminists, but also development practitioners working in the Global South. Quickly running through my presentation. Too sure. So our book chapter title is Reimagining Development from Local Voices and Position, where Southern feminist movements take lead. And we argue this on the basis, as I've said, that we are Southern-based feminists and also development practitioners. And our argument before we get into it is the locus point is feminism. And I know most of us in this platform, we've had or come across feminism being described in various forms. And it has had a different narrative and connotation, and much of it, some of it, or a couple average parts of it has been very on a negative side, but we want to also give it a positivity in it because of the thing feminism has done for us at the Global South. So therefore, this is just a recollection of what has come out in terms of feminism, but we want to sort of give it another nuances to it. From our book chapter, feminism is actually an advocacy tool or agenda to change power, change different positions that kind of have a different affect to different types of people. And when I mean types of people, I talk about the intersectional self. So it is not just saying it's about women, no, it is about looking at different intersecting identities and therefore bringing this in terms of using this feminism as a tool towards geared aspects of what can we do better? What are the equilibrium positions we need to change? And that's the discussion point we start with our book. And our argument is, why should Southern feminist movements take lead? So we have four intersecting or interlacing and interlinked elements. And first is from the relationship between Southern feminism and patriarchy. And then we also see or bring forward or postulate an argument about feminist struggles and resistance in the legacy of colonialism. And also we appreciate that indigenous knowledges have also been an important driver in driving the Southern feminist agenda, and they've also been an ingredient in contributing to them taking lead in various agendas that Southern feminism have been involved in. And we also see almost a broadening pathway in towards which has strengthened Southern feminism to be where they are today, starting all the way since they were formed. And I would like to flag this, that we do not argue as Southern feminism in the terms of Southern feminism, but we argue from how women movement evolved from the time of patriarchy all the way to today in what we see. And our discussion point comes in with driven examples. So kindly allow me to unpack a little bit what you see on your screen. So on the first hand, we see element one, particularly looking at the relationship between Southern feminism and patriarchy. And here as well, I would like to bring our attention, or kind of go back to the archives when patriarchy came to the forefront, which still exists. We are not saying that patriarchy has been fully dealt with, it has been eroded from our society, no. But when it came to be a recognizable factor, we see traditional women. They were not back then called feminists, but they were women who came together as a collective to exert pressure to resist patriarchal power. And we see they used various forms and tactics to do this. And we also appreciate that they actually tap to cultural practices to resist this power. We see them in ceremonial occasions using wax songs or folk songs or riddles or proverbs, dancing to detail their grievances and enforce compliances that is non-oppressive. And we also see the same particular women lobbying for spaces in leadership. And a good example, what you see from where I'm seated is on my far right, but I think from your end, it should be the far left. We see a good example from the Ashanti Queen Mothers, who from this aspect of these collective pressure groups were able to command even soldiers to go to war, were able to occupy leadership positions. And these are very well descriptive of a leadership stool, of a chief stool that they occupy. They were able to resolve disputes. And therefore, we argue that on the basis of this, we can see already them Southern feminism taking almost a proactive step in leadership. So therefore, we are not falling short by saying that they should be given an opportunity to drive the development agenda, because it has already been done and tested. So it has gone through the flames of fire, and therefore we can see the outcome of it. The other element that we bring to the fore is that we want to acknowledge that the indigenous knowledge found in the Southern feminism movement and practices has its own career role in bringing to the stage the leadership role of in the Southern feminism. And this is where I would like to argue that indigenous knowledges environment, and therefore it would be oblivion of us to assume that we know, so therefore we advise the global South in its development agenda, whereas we know that local environment has an inbuilt framework of indigenous knowledges that exist, and it is in some cases privy to the people, to the local communities. And we see that the Southern feminism or feminists has taken the indigenous knowledge as support system to drive the agenda for resistance, and also support and also use it to negotiate among the feminists themselves, but also local communities. We've seen that local Southern feminist movement and practices making use of these indigenous knowledges to actually enter into spaces that are locked. And therefore we brave ourselves to saying that, yes, these are the Southern feminists have been able to utilize local resources to drive their agenda forward. And also having in mind that they are very much aware of those very invisible or implicit knowledges that can be used, that if you are a person from externality coming inside, it will be impossible, practically impossible for you to know what exists in the ecosystem and therefore make use of it to work for you. So therefore, that is why we get the courage notion to say that Southern feminism, from their local positionality, they should take lead. And we've also seen these indigenous knowledges as a good practical example being used to advise in healing, to advise in health, in agriculture, the value system, in governance. So therefore, it is not short to say that indigenous knowledges and how the Southern feminism have made an interplay to make sure that the community interest is being driven forward. The third element is that informs our argument or our positioning is that the feminism or the struggles that the feminists have had in the context or in the realm of colonialism help us to also argue for their leadership, argue for them to take lead. Why do we say so? We see that when we move from an era of patriarchy and then we have an in-between era of colonialism, and we see in colonialism the movements, the women movements that were developed or co-created did not die out. They were actually reinforced because women came together and they still use these traditional networks to resist colonial aspects, the oppressive colonial aspects that were being brought by the existence of people who had not previously lived in the continent. Therefore, they leveraged on this traditional system to intensify resistance. I'll give a very vivid example, me being a Kenyan by birth. We see them using something very unique. In English, it's called ululation, but in traditional Kikuyu culture, it's called ngemi. They would make this ngemi, it goes, allow me to say, it goes like that. There are this ululation that would go to the mass gathering to actually push people to protest what was happening in terms of the things that were negatively affecting communities. That was not just an aspect that was seen in Kenya. It is spread across the continent. And by your far right, which is your far left, you see this lady, Pelewara. She was a market leader. And this market leader, out of the association or collective of women that were formed during patriarchal time, she gained leadership at the marketplace. And she created the Lagos Market Women Association, which was actually an advocacy group. So when the colonialists landed in Lagos and they were trying to push for taxation, this women group was able to push back and say, we cannot actually adhere to the tax system on the basis that we are just market players and we are selling fish, and therefore the tax regime that you want to introduce is actually going to make our businesses die down. And therefore we see even the colonial government revoking the taxation bill that they had been introduced, and therefore bringing it down to say that, well, women who are selling fish should not be taxed, and the ones that should be taxed should at least make a market return of 200 pounds, therefore allowing even peasantry women to continue doing business. So, and that's why we are saying it's short to say that these women have actually stood and been tested, are tried, and therefore are able to say that today they can take lead on the basis of the ancient things that have occurred and the successes that can be seen up to date. The element number 4 is we
Can you
see
keep
all
it
these
short,
women.
Jerry, the fourth
Yes,
element? Thanks.
sorry.
Can you keep it short, the fourth element, as we need to continue to the next speaker? Thanks.
Yes, yes. The fourth element that we see is the emancipation that has strengthened the Southern feminism. And this emancipation has occurred in various forms and shapes. So we see education, employment, entrepreneurship, political representation. And out of all this, it has born various elements in different parts of the world. And that's a good example that is far left. And we can see it as the green movement, which occurred across the world, not only in Buenos Aires, but also in other parts of the world. And why should we take lead? We have seen that there is no such thing as a single struggle. The struggle has been real. The struggle has been manifold, multifold, and on various levels. So therefore, that the argument is that let us reimagine development with optimal terms for development cooperation, in which we say that resilient, vibrant feminist movements, who are groups of people and organizations, should be backed up towards ensuring that we invest in the relationships that have already been created. We invest in doing intersectional feminist analysis of issues. We invest in collaborative effort, and we invest in connections of different constituencies across the globe. And that building of coalition between the North and the South, where cross-exchange and learning takes place, and uptaking of working practices, therefore building a power to agenda. And therefore, we are not saying that we the Southern feminists are in 100% arena or ecosystem where we are saying we do not need others. Actually, we need others to prosper, and therefore the needing others will be on a complementary level, especially in financial resources, and also collecting all these knowledges and spreading them across. So I will stop there, and thank you so much. And I look forward to more interaction as we continue in the session.
Thank you, Njeri, for this inspirational presentation with a lot of passion and expertise. Thanks very much. Let's continue to the next one. I think that's let me have a look. Thamrise, are you ready? Yes, please take the floor.
Thank you very much. Welcome, everybody. It's great to be here today and also being part of this fantastic book. It was a wonderful experience. So thank you to all the editors, and great to see some of the other authors here as well. I don't have a PowerPoint presentation, unfortunately, but I will hopefully just walk you through my chapter, which is entitled Moving Beyond Enforced North-South Collaboration for Development Possibilities from Pakistan. So I'm a development practitioner from Pakistan, based in Pakistan at the moment. I've spent about 25 years in counting as a practitioner in the sector here. And my chapter is basically a pun on words. So enforced is not just one word. Sorry, I should have at least had that up on a PowerPoint, but it is the EN in parentheses in brackets and forced. So I played on the word enforced in terms of how the North and South collaborate when it comes to development. And I say this because I think the collaboration is not a natural one. I think it's a very forced collaboration, where the global North is the dominant one telling the global South what its development should be and how it should do it. And it enforces this unnatural collaboration by its contractual obligations as an aid provider. So we will enforce these modalities of aid upon you to force the collaboration with us on how development should be done. And so most of us in the global South are basically subservient to global North donor agencies because the money comes from them. And that's how we choose to, quote unquote, develop ourselves. So my chapter wanted to look at the other side of this. What if we moved beyond this sort of traditional enforced collaboration where we don't really have much say in the matter? And there's been a lot of discussion now about decolonization and localization of aid, and I am not a supporter of either of those two terms, and I do talk a little bit about it in my chapter about why I feel that way. So I want to move even beyond those debates. And I do that by looking at Pakistan as a case study and looking at 4 different organizations in Pakistan from 4 different sectors, which have been traditionally donor-induced sectors in Pakistan. And those are education, health, microcredit, and humanitarian aid. So in these 4 sectors, the donor community in Pakistan is very active. Majority of the projects that we see being funded and these enforced collaborations where we have to do projects on primary education, girls' education, basic health, providing people with income, et cetera, And I've looked at these 4 organizations which actually have not been subservient to Northern donor organizations in order to run them. And these are massive examples. These are not just small, isolated little examples in one area. These are national examples that I've used. And I'll just go through them one by one. In education, I've used the example of an organization in Pakistan called the Citizens Foundation. So the Citizens Foundation was set up by a group of Pakistani businessmen and philanthropists within Pakistan and from outside of Pakistan to provide basic education and literacy to children all over the country. And their model is a custom-based model. So they fundraise within Pakistan, but majority of their funding comes from the diaspora outside Pakistan in different parts of the world. And they custom built and designed schools all over the country. And they recruit children and they recruit teachers and they train them from those local communities. And it's a phenomenon. I mean, they've got about 300,000 students in over 700 schools across the country. And they are a force to be reckoned with. And they do not take Northern donor funding. They may take a little bit of a one-off projects for things like curriculum development or teacher training, but the bulk, 85% of their operating costs in running these and managing these schools is entirely focused through local fundraising. And so this gives them the independence to design their own curriculum, to teach their own, train their own teachers, to recruit teachers from those particular villages or towns where the schools are built, to basically see the needs of the communities where they want to build their schools. And so it's a very, very, I hate to use the word, but a localized approach to education development. The second example is the Indus Health Network. So this is, again, another organization that began in 2007. And so it's relatively new, but again, it was businessmen and doctors from Pakistan and outside of Pakistan who invested in a philanthropic endeavor to build a network of hospitals around the country. And these hospitals provide no-cost treatment, medical treatment to the needy and at cost for whoever can pay. And now they are a massive network. They're building campuses across the country. They've got a medical university they want to also set up. And a lot of this money, again, comes from fundraising, from their fundraising arms across the country, from mostly Pakistani diaspora. The third example, and they've really revolutionized the health network here, providing literally basic services to everybody who comes to them for free. The third example is microcredit, and that I've used the example of an organization called the Akhuwat Foundation. So the Akhuwat Foundation is a model that is 100% pure charity-led. So it uses the Islamic concept of zakat, which is a religious alms giving or religious charity given that every Muslim is obliged to provide to the needy. And they've used zakat and, again, local donations to support almost $4 million worth of grants and microcredit grants to people across the country. 2 million loans, I'm sorry, not 4 million. And they've got about 800 branches across 4 cities and towns across the country. And so they use Islamic financing and the Islamic principle of solidarity as a way to collect money and then to give interest-free loans, microfinance loans to people in need. And they were recently, the head of the organization, its founder, recently in 2021 won the sort of the Asian Nobel Prize. It's the Raymond Magsaysay Award. And my final example is in the humanitarian assistance sector, and I've used the example of the EIDHI Foundation. The EIDHI Foundation is Pakistan's oldest and most well-known humanitarian assistance organizations, and it was started by its founder, Abdul Sattar EIDHI, who has now passed away a few years ago. And it is a completely selfless and voluntarily run network of humanitarian support, again, across the country. And the organization manages from orphanages to women's shelters to food banks to providing burial services and disaster assistance. It is literally the first on the scene at every disaster or conflict sort of area in the country. And it also provides assistance globally. It recently also sent a lot of assistance to Turkey and Syria for the earthquake. But it is, again, an entirely charity and donation-run model. And very, very homegrown. It is something that the country has become proud of. And I think the humanitarian assistance sector internationally needs to use it as an example. But unfortunately, it's a very unknown example, despite its scale and scope in Pakistan. So these 4 examples that I have taken have basically got 3 particular outcomes through their efforts that challenge the traditional model of North-South collaboration for development. They challenge the traditional model of aid giving for development. And these 3 components, the first one is sustainable funding. So all 4 examples are financially supported through charitable and philanthropic donations from both within and outside Pakistan. They've got specific chapters or arms that they have in different parts of the world whose job is just to raise funds. So they don't need to really look and apply for funding elsewhere. And this sort of funding is in a way unlimited because people from Pakistan always want to do good within Pakistan, particularly the diaspora. So it's really funneled and channeled into that aspect of revenue generation, which is in a way unlimited for them. It will come in throughout the year whenever they need, particularly when there's a particular crisis. Pakistanis overseas will give, as well as other organizations. So that's a very strong mechanism of sustainable funding that they've developed, which you will not see with the traditional Global North aid model. The second outcome is scalability. So all 4 examples are national in their scope. We're talking about hundreds of schools and hundreds of hospital networks and, millions of people, hundreds and thousands of people benefiting. We're not talking about a small little, district or village or town. And traditional donor funding doesn't have that sort of reach. Their projects will never be able to reach nationally at that scale. And so this is, again, an outcome of a model that is very, very traditionally Pakistani, homegrown and developed and doesn't depend on international aid funding. The third outcome is replicability. So education, health, microcredit, all these are very basic needs of the country, and we will never tire of them. And we have health and education systems in the country that are ineffective and they are apathetic, and there's a serious gap. So these organizations are filling in that gap, and their model is simple enough for others to follow because they didn't come from wealth. It was a basic need that everybody got together and say, okay, so how do we fund this? And they've grown from there. Whereas replicating a lot of donor-funded models is very difficult. Because a lot of them are, again, very isolated, very limited. They are not scalable or replicable in many ways. So I think the whole idea and model of the fact that we are not able to develop our own indigenous models of development is incorrect. And these models don't have to be forced upon us by the Global North, and they don't have to be enforced on us through the way of international aid modalities. Now, granted, majority of these models are very, very dependent on charity. And charity is not the only practice. Also, a lot of this is faith-based and faith-motivated, and that should not be the only model. But it is a model to show that this can be done. We can move away from the, sorry about that, we can move away from this traditional dependency that we have on the Global North funding model and their design models and their programmatic approaches that they take, many of which don't actually fit our current context. And so I think the whole idea and implication this has for how we can change collaboration between Global North and Global South is immense. I don't mean to say that the collaboration should never happen, but I think we need to change and broaden this collaboration and look more towards the Global South for developing the guidelines for this collaboration. Like I said, all 4 organizations do also look to the Global North for funding, small components of their programs, etc. But they're not 100% dependent on them. And that's why they have outlasted the traditional aid funding for so long. So I'll end with the fact that there is hope. And these examples reinforce the idea that the leading role a civil society organized in line with local priorities and resources can play in the South. And the success of these 4 organizations has shown that locally led organizations are perfectly capable of taking over the role, mostly played and dominated by Northern development actors, including donors and INGOs. So I will end there, and hopefully everyone will get a chance to read the chapter and all the other chapters in the book as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Thamrise, and a beautiful final hopeful word in particular. If you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat, or thoughts, comments, feedback, ideas, everything that you would and could like to share. Feel free to put them in the chat for the speakers. Let's quickly continue. We have Awal and Marijke.
Yes, I will start. Good afternoon to everyone. Awal and I are really excited to be here. I will start. Awal will take over very soon. And I will introduce us in the course of our story. Because if you ask us what has given us the best insight into the promotion or hindrance of Southern leadership in programming, we as 2 practitioners would not refer to research and evaluations. Rather, we would tell you about our conversations. So these conversations are the story that we wrote in this book. It is called The Journey to Southern Leadership in Programming. And it is really a story from within. And that makes it quite delicate. It makes it also complex. And yeah, unfortunately, we have only a few minutes now to roll it out. So we will briefly touch upon some of our learnings. And we really would love you to read our entire chapter, because there's so much more in it. Our conversations unfolded over the years, while and after we participated in 2 consecutive multi-year Dutch-funded programs. These were so-called strategic partnerships. These strategic partnerships programs were carried out by a consortium of Dutch-British civil society organizations, CSOs, who each individually contracted Southern CSOs. And these Southern CSOs, for their part, had to work together in country alliances in several countries in Africa and in Asia. And in these 2 programs, Awal and I occupied pivotal positions. Awal in Ghana as ED of one of the participating CSOs, but also the chair of the Ghanaian Country Alliance. And I myself in the Netherlands as a program manager and later advisor at the Northern Consortium Secretariat, which was based at the lead organization. The main goal of the programs was improving sexual and reproductive health and rights among young people. But driven by critical thoughts on what happened in and around the programs, despite, I must say, the growing Northern, especially Northern rhetoric on Southern leadership, we engaged in an in-depth learning dialogue, so to say. And we understand Southern leadership as CSOs in the Global South, shaping programs, roles, collaborations on their own terms. Southern CSOs are not the Northern partners. They are independent organizations in their own right and embedded in the social and political context they navigate in. Our story is partly a personal account, but additionally, we asked a group of colleagues in Ghana and in the Netherlands and UK who were involved with us in the programs to comment on several drafts we wrote. And we were guided by literature on power and on white supremacy. We draw particularly on Pancerti and Bindi's review of the discourse on power. Very shortly, they propose a differentiation of power over, power to, and power with. And generally, power over refers to an asymmetrical relation between two or more actors or groups of actors. Power to is an actor's ability to achieve certain outcomes. And power with is a group's ability to act together in view of collective outcomes or goals. And these concepts helped us to interpret what happened in the programs. And for instance, there were processes where the Northern CSOs intended to create more space for a power to context, whereas the Ghanaian CSOs still experienced this as power over. And in a reflection on the power concepts with the Ghanaian actors in our writing process, one person suggested also to refine the concept of power to with power within. And power within we understand as the confidence of recognizing one's power to take ownership over one's situation and call for change. So far for this brief introduction from my side, I now hand over to Awal, and he will lead you through the story that we wrote. Please, Awal, go ahead.
Okay. Yes, we distinguish 4 key moments or processes in the program cycle where Southern leadership should be looked at. So in all our learning, we decided to look at 4 key areas just because of how it came up in our journey. We are looking at strategic decision-making in program design and strategic positioning in governance, and also selection of CSOs and their capacity building, and collaboration and stakeholder processes, with the last one being accountability. So I share with you how we experience these 4 in our journey and how we have documented that in the book. If you look at key moments of strategic decision-making and governance, we observe and we, in fact, program design or theory of change tells how a program would be implemented and what kind of desired change is expected. What we observe, especially in the case of the first program, 2013, we realized the first time Southern organizations saw the theory of change was at the inception meeting. So what it meant was that how the change was going to take place was predetermined by the North. And so the Dutch CSOs who expressed interest in working with some Ghanaian organizations determined how change was going to take place in the Global South. In our journey, we found this interesting and something worth documenting and sharing. And we felt it's very important that in a program design like this, the South co-create the theory of change in the program. There was an attempt to include or involve Southern organization in the second phase, which was 2016. But then what happened was that Southern organizations were allowed to develop the proposals to look at what they intended to do and to submit to the North for validation. So at the end, the final document, which was adopted, had more of the Northern approval, more of the Northern endorsement. And so it reflected on what the Northern partners thought about the program than the Southern organization. So although this expertise was recognized by the North in terms of the Southern organizations' work in SRHR, their existence, their expertise on the context and all that, the adoption of those expertise was, in the recognition, like the adoption of these ideas were not reflected in the program. So the dialogue, the strategically co-design, the theory of change was not that impressive. It wasn't as the Southern organizations wish. So instead, we think that the Ghanaian CSOs were asked to just color the already made theory of change, the boxes, and to just give endorsement to what came from the Northern organization. And what is also important is the governance. The program governance did not provide a Southern Steering Committee of the Country Alliance. So we had alliances from the Southern organization and also had steering committee from the North. But what we saw was the steering committee from the North was seen to be the highest. And so the steering committees from the Global South were managed or supervised by program officers from the Northern organization. So we asked, where lies the equality? Where is that partnership? So what kind of power relationship existed? So certainly we said there was that kind of power over on this partner. Then one other thing has to do with the collaboration. So the absence of a shared strategic dialogue also influenced a particular element in the second program. They aim to make the country alliances sustainable and continue after the programs were finished. The Northern Consortium perceived this as an opportunity to contribute to Southern leadership. The intention was good. It was giving power to the Southern organization. But then it was an outcome, or the outcome of it was predetermined at the program design stage. And the Ghanaian organization's role was to accept it and take their progress on a tracking template. Moreover, it was some kind of a forced marriage between the Ghanaian CSOs, work together because the Northern organizations want you to work together. And these were one of the weaknesses that we observed. The Northern CSOs were hesitant to even engage with the country alliances on their future. Again, the intention was good because they felt like they didn't want to interfere in the work of the Northern alliances, but this was later on expressed differently as the Southern organization felt betrayed, and they felt like the intention was to impose on them to have what? Country alliances. Of course, the nature of CSO selection was seen to be like a power over, because the programs were designed from the North, and then individual consortium members decided to look for partners from the South. So basically, it was to share with them what they intended to do in Global South and how they wanted them as partners to come in. And so in terms of capacity, it was like the Northern organizations are okay when it comes to capacity, and Southern organizations needed capacity in area of advocacy and all other things. So we found this particular experience needs to be well documented, needs to be shared, needs to be documented for learning. Of course, in terms of accountability, we're actually concerned that there are so many discussions going on regarding accountability. But then we share with you our experience around this, that the Northern organizations felt like, oh, we were not in any way accountable to the Southern organization. Our role was to ask the questions, demand of the Southern organization to account for resources. Whilst the Northern organization had that flexibility of putting certain things in the budget to enhance their capacity, the Southern organizations lacked that, and that flexibility eluded them. Yeah, so that is what I can say about the accountability. Marika may want to look at all this and then draw some conclusions. Marika.
Yes, it was very, very quick going through all the key processes where we think that Southern leadership should have been present, but wasn't always. So our journey, when you go and in a chapter we have much more elaborated on the different processes, but then our journey confirmed that the mindset of Northern actors, and it's not only the CSOs, that's also the funding Dutch ministry, they have been a serious impediment to effectuate Southern leadership. Although there were now and then several power to elements, but on the other hand, the power over approaches were still prevalent. And especially what we found is the opportunities for power with strategies. They were missed. So really thinking together about how you can promote Southern leadership, doing that together, that these kind of power with strategies were missed. And we also often wondered, hindsight, what if Southern actors had raised more of their power within? Because that was also something that really could have changed the settings. Our conclusion is that the changes are inevitable, not only in mindsets, also in systems, and it will require a lot of personal growth and also of political will. For instance, in the Netherlands political setting, the Dutch grant mechanism needs a fundamental change. There's a call for upside down thinking and from starting from priorities in southern countries instead of establishing policy priorities in the Netherlands. And that's really very, very timely. Because without the involvement of Southern CSOs in developing program focus areas, program design, and selection of Southern and Northern organizations, Southern leadership will remain elusive. And in the same spirit, we really think that a memorandum of understanding regarding power balance should be standard prior to submitting a funding application. What we also found, and what we also found in our own conversations, the two of us, is that there is fear. There's really fear at both sides. Fear in the north to lose control, fear in the south to lose funding, to name a few. And allaying fears is really necessary, but it can only happen in a spirit of openness, trust, and mutual accountability, and a common understanding of implications. So we think that Southern CSOs should make demands in a genuine dialogue, also building trust among fellow Southern CSOs, instead of allowing competition for funding, because that was what we also found in the programs. So our conclusion is that the North should not withdraw, but commit to sustained cooperation and support, but on Southern terms. And the Northern CSOs should be very much aware that Southern CSOs may change the rules of the game, including the Northern role. But they should, above all, have the boldness to undergo the journey of a genuine dialogue, something that the two of us also did. And it can be scary, and it is really going into unknown territory, and it is really entering a new world. It was for a while, it was for me. We both entered new worlds while we were talking about it. So this is not yet even about new roles for the North. This is the stage before you can really come to new roles for the North. And well, there's a lot more to say about it, but I leave it here for the sake of time. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joël and Marijke, and everything else you can read in the chapter of the book. And again, you can download the book for free. I have just put again the link in the chat. Let's quickly continue with some final conclusions from Margit. Margit, please keep it short, as afterwards we would like to go to our discussant who has read the book and will provide us with some critical and inspirational perspectives after having read the book. But first, Margit, some of the conclusions of the book.
I am muted. Yes, hello. Thank you so much for giving the floor back to me, and thanks our speakers for your great stories on the different chapters. So just about the conclusions of the book. So what we also did was look across the book. What are the main patterns that we see regarding basic principles of collaborations? And we looked at roles, relations, and processes. So who can do what, who is important, why, and how can we have a good process of building collaborations. So looking at roles then, which are then closely connected to relations, what really stood out was that it's about this recognition of CSOs in the South as drivers of development because they are so embedded in their context, because they're able to do something there, have local legitimacy, have relations that they can put to work, and they are only in the position to actually manage those relations and to use that capital. And they do that in very diverse ways, and they have different possibilities and different opportunities and different constraints, context defined. That really shapes their possibilities. And it's from that recognition that collaboration can happen. And an INGO or a big donor from abroad is just one node in that bigger network that defines possibilities for Southern CSOs. So it's about recognizing that and really relativizing then the role of INGOs. They can be important, but indeed, as Marijke said, on Southern terms. So what you then have is that relation-wise, domestic relations come to the fore. They come forward as much more important and much more central in figuring out what development can look like, what can be done, what challenges need to be met. And it's only these Southern organizations that have the capacity to actually manage these relations and see also the relative role of INGOs and in that situations. And if you look at the book, then it's as investors, it's in complementary roles, and it's in facilitating and accompanying Southern CSOs. And if you look at then at the quality of the relation based on that, one thing that stands out is mutuality. So mutuality is then really about seeing the other, respecting, acknowledging the interdependence and the embeddedness of relations of CSOs in multiple relations, and coming together in a way that is based in this recognition. And if you look at processes, then that means in this context, what needs to happen to actually have this collaboration type come about? It's then away from that linear North-South relation, and it's toward facilitating Southern CSOs in relating effectively to their context, rather than the constant struggle that Southern CSOs constantly have to go in translating to INGOs, trying to survive with their agenda, trying to protect their agenda from being disrupted by imposed understandings and priorities. And this is then really about the defining of programs within Southern context, but again, then very much linking up with possibilities of INGOs and actors in the global North, because of the importance of that power that they also have. And here too, we see mutuality as coming in as really important. This is just considering the terms that people in the book use to talk about what kind of processes to have. So it's about negotiation, it's about reflecting, it's about building assets, linking up with what is there. This set of terms come in a big way. And we also have them based on this, an agenda for research and practice, because all this would need to develop, yeah? So big questions emerge for donors, for INGOs and the development sector on the whole. So how to actually not start out from a program that an INGO or a donor has, but how to start from what is already there in the global South. How do you identify different forms of added value that an INGO can have to Southern initiatives? What kinds of initiative then actually to engage with, yeah? How do initiatives that start from the global South actually perform differently? We see lots of claims in the book and anecdotal material, but there's no systematic research on this. And under what conditions do what forms of collaboration work well? Does Southern leadership actually deliver? What is then a Northern role to play there? And how do we actually balance tensions that can come up here? And then also how to identify which organizations to work with, because Southern CSOs are not all perfect and great and locally legitimate. They have also been shaped in many ways for many of them by being embedded in the aid sector and losing local legitimacy and being geared to local context because of that. So that is an issue, how to also work with the very varied perspectives and the very conflicting understandings that may emerge in seeking out partners. And then also do not romanticize Southern CSOs and the local. And what then becomes of the question of legitimacy? Whose legitimacy are you looking for if it's not the legitimacy of the program, like a program on women's rights or climate action or whatever it may be, but whose criteria for legitimacy and whose legitimacy then come to matter? Those are just basic questions that can that emerge from the book for us. Justice, do you have anything to add? Okay, well, maybe later. Sorry for being quick, but this is all just to give more space to Tassima, who will share her thoughts now on the book. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much for having me, Alex, and all the different authors of this book. I enjoyed reading it. My name is Twasima Bijirwa. I am a Ugandan Afrofeminist, I guess, international practitioner who likes to ideate on what freedom can look like. So I found this particular call to reimagine what else can be really inspiring. And I also like to think of this period that we find ourselves in as really a period where we can explore newness, right? Which is what this book is asking us to really think through. What else can come from the ways in which we've been working, especially in development, especially in civil society. And yet, as I read this book, I also found myself with a lot more questions than answers, which I guess is the natural course of the process of reimagination. And so my hope is that in sharing these outwardly, we can reflect on them together, right? So the first thing that stands out for me is this question of shifting the power. And so when I think about shifting the power, I think about questions of identity, autonomy, dignity, history, economies, etc., etc., and how those affect our ability to reimagine, right? And so while I agree with the authors that the task ahead demands of us to reconstruct relationships, to reimagine collaborations, and while it's also true that those on the margins are better able than those in power to deconstruct power structures, I also ask, who has the freedom to dream and who can actually be front and center of this work? Can the colonized, whose material realities, as we know them to be, as this book explores, who are deliberately kept away from historical and political education and realities, speak? Do they have the ability to actually shape what this new collaboration can look like, what this new world can look like, right? That's the first question that I sit with. The second one is, in situating where we are now and where we want to be, I recognize that the power balances that exist between Northern CSOs and Southern CSOs exist within a certain framework that is perpetuated not just through political impositions, but cultural ones too. And this is enabled not just by civil society actors in the North, but through a neo-colonial machinery with institutions such as IMF, World Bank, that continue to yield significant power and upon which this financing model that is at the heart of aid and development is structured, right? So I'm interested in the notion of what solidarity can look like within that context. What then is the role of Northern INGOs when we are continually faced with these realities? When we understand the ways in which the Dutch Foreign Affairs policy continues to even just contradict the work that INGOs are doing, right? So what does solidarity look like in that context? And these are very complex questions that are not clear-cut, but these are some of the things that emerged as I read this book. And so as we think about the power cube, I like the term power cube as is used in the book. As we think about the power cube and why things remain as they do, I ask, how can we unlink these exploitative interests from the ways in which we work when they are so embedded in the same structure upon which this work is built? And what is our role as all of us who think of ourselves inherently as do-gooders, because that is why we come to development work, I hope. What is our role in changing that dynamic? So related to that, it's also important to remember how NGOs in many Southern countries came to be and how that continues to shape their ability to do the work, but also to be seen as legitimate, right? In Uganda, for example, NGOs are directly linked to the collapse of the welfare state, right? And this is in the 1980s, and this is as a result of, things like structure, in collaboration with things like structure adjustment policies and whatnot and whatnot. Now, it's been rightfully stated in the book that Southern CSOs continue to have to negotiate their legitimacy in diverse audiences, but even more so to the constituencies upon which they say they serve, right? And the question is, how are these legitimate issues going to shift when the very foundation upon which many of them are built is as shaky as it is, right? Now, I also want to add one more fundamental critique to Southern NGOs, which is also at the heart of how development work is currently being done and should be at the heart of how we reimagine what this collaboration can look like. And it is this attempt to fragment development, to fragment freedom, right? So we understand that we do not live single issue lives, and yet one of the most limiting ways in which we currently work while trying to address complex development question is to look at these problems that persist as if they exist in isolation of one another. And that's just not true. But this is how many of our institutions are formed, right? So you have an organization that focuses on SRHR, sexual reproductive health rights, and then that's a standalone. And then you have an organization that focuses on health. And then you have another organization that focuses on gender-based violence, right? And all these seem to be operating in isolation of one another, right? So as opposed to understanding the interlinkages of the systemic problems that continue to persist, right? But this is at the very heart upon which institutions, both INGOs and local institutions are built. So as we begin to reimagine what collaboration can look like, what perhaps even intersectionality can look like within the work that we do, how do we work through some of those realities? A continued theme around this book is also the issue of resourcing. We understand that money, of course, has always been political. It controls who has access, who is valued, and has shaped the dynamics between INGOs and Southern CSOs, right? Now, it's also true that Northern funding has always been seen as vital to the survival of development work. And I would like for us to sit with whether this is actually true. Is this true that without Northern funding, movement work, development work, organizing work in the South can't exist? Some of the interviewers that were interviewed in this book also asserted that the mobilization of domestic and local resources is vital in supporting local organizations to address significant structural challenges. I would agree with that, but I would also like to add that community funding is the very basis upon which many of our societies are built, that this is not something that is new. And we must ask, why do we continually situate it as something that is foreign, as something that is just being created, when many of our societies have inherently been built like this, right? Where the provision of key social services and health and livelihood support have always come from supporting each other, that communitarianism, right, that already exists. Right. And yeah, and actually gradually is being fragmented by the ways in which we're doing development work currently. We only even have to look at the ways in which African society, let's even just look at Uganda responded during COVID, at the height of COVID, when all INGOs left and there was no staff and vaccines were being hoarded and there was a crisis and they were ringing doom bells. Who came together? Community came together. People were giving, even when they had no idea where else it was going to come from, they were giving. And this has been the culture of it. And so I think it's really dishonest to imply in any form that this would be a new concept. Now, the second major theme in this book, as Professor Majid stated when she was starting, is that starting from the South, right? Now, I was really inspired by the chapter on reimagining development from local voices and positions, Southern feminist movements in the lead. And I'll tell you why. The kind of capitalist patriarchal system that we're currently fighting today is born out of this hegemonic view that constructs the generic human subject as male, as white male, right? Now, there are many successes that have been recorded in this book about movements led by African women. There are many that have not. There are many that we don't even know about because of the ways in which history has been shaped. The book asserts that Southern feminists can foster emancipation informed by inherent indigenous knowledge that has emerged from Southern feminists themselves. I agree. We don't even have to look too far back. I think about in 2018 when young Ugandan feminists on Twitter organized a march that attracted not just feminists from Uganda, but had feminists from all across Africa showing up in protest of then killings of women. I think about things like Fees Must Fall in South Africa, and all these seemingly sporadic movements that just happened, led by young people, led by young feminists, led by people who exist on the complete margins of society, that are resourced internally, that pull from each other's strength, that don't seem to need to go through the very specific traditional rules and systems, right? But that spark real social change, real transformational change, that have governments shaking, right? Now, in this book, the DD Manifesto is referenced, and it presents development as a locally owned process, working through local conveners, mobilizing all those with a stake in progress, blending design implementation through rapid cycles of planning, action, reflection, and revision, and drawing on local knowledge, feedback, and energy, right? And I agree with that. And that is the basis upon which we should form any kind of development work, any kind of collaboration, any kind of thinking about how we ideate towards this current system, which I hope we can all agree is simply not working for any of us. So I'm also left in this imagination of freedom with a question as to whether we can dare stretch ourselves to imagine, perhaps even outside the confines of INGOs and even local ones, right? Because organizing work is existing outside these institutions. And I really wonder whether the master's house can ever dismantle whether the master's tools can ever really dismantle the master's house. And so in these reflections, it's been important to stress the necessity of indigenous knowledge. I would also like that we should engender that knowledge, right? The need to examine local constructions as a baseline for this work, the reconstruction of financing models that allow for autonomy, shifting narratives, self-sustainability, as well as the necessary work to reconstruct both the individual and institutional relationships between North and South. Now, I agree with all those, and in the spirit of reimagining, I would also like to add a couple of more. One, subversive organizing, which is playing against the system and drawing from wider movements like sex workers, workers' unions, and others, right, who really center the most marginalized in our communities. Moving towards narratives that center the possibilities, dreams, and aspirations of people and not just their limitations. I would also like for us to explore what funding models outside traditional NGO structures actually looks like. What does it mean to rapidly respond in times of crisis outside just these very set systems and parameters, right? I would also like for us to end with the concept of freedom for all, as I hope we do as we organize and as we conceptualize development. Who is most on the margins and who is most affected by the ways in which we currently work? That is the image that we have to have in our minds as we try to reshape what development of any kind can look like. Thank you.
Wow, Twasima, thank you very much for your critical perspectives and my mind is cracking at the moment, and I'm having a lot of thoughts and questions. Also seeing a lot of questions being shared in the chat, and perhaps some of the speakers would like to respond to Twasima's points as well. At the current moment, it's time. At the same time, we also see that there is a lot of traction, a lot of questions coming up. So for those who can stay with us, please feel free to stay, as we will now dive into the Q&A and the discussion part. For those who need to leave, thank you very much for being present here with us today. We are going to share a mail afterwards, which will include the recording of this session, the book, and other resources. So thank you very much for participating in this book launch of today. Don't forget to read the book, of course, for those who are leaving. For those who are staying with us, feel free to ask your question in the chat. And perhaps I can give the word to one of the presenters who would like to respond to some of the points that Twasima raised.
Maybe I can start just to give it a first shot.
Okay.
Well, thanks so much, Twasima, for so many important points that definitely I at least can relate to. And I just pick out two and just briefly react to give space also to others. Yeah, one of your questions was, is it possible to reimagine, given the constraining power relations, who has the freedom to dream, so to say? Yeah. Well, if you look at research on resistance to the superimposition of rules and roles and conditions on collaboration, you see that this freedom to dream is there, at least with many organizations that were asked about that. You see that behind the scenes, there is always, well, always, I can't say, but we see many cases of strategic maneuvering, manipulating, translating, trying to, fit the donors or INGOs rules, while at the same time under the radar still continuing with their own agenda and their own understandings, because that's what the work is rooted in. The donor is someone to adapt to a lot of the time, but there is something then there that needs to be adapted, and that maintains there is, I think, this continuity with organizations, the good ones at least, that understand why they're there, understand what matters in their society, and understand where they're coming from. And that's something I think to also acknowledge. It's just, I think that in many situations, the freedom to speak is not there, the freedom to actually speak about these things, because there's this fear, as was rightly put out in this conversation today, that you'll be in trouble if you contradict. So that's one thing. And then also this question of yours, how to build legitimacy when you are in such dependence on INGOs and donors. Yeah, how to take up that leading Southern role if you're embedded in this donor system. And I think that's where we need this recognition, that it is from these other Southern, that is this dependence on Southern CSOs, the recognition that the chapters speak of, that hopefully can encourage the international community also to see that a local legitimacy is the starting point, and that you also need to give space to Southern CSOs to build that legitimacy. In fact, I think it's the next big issue. Local legitimacy, how to sustain that, how to build that, how to protect that, also for the international aid system to maintain its legitimacy. That's my take on this one. Thanks.
Alex, can I also respond? I think Twasima, for me, there are 2 points. First, I think we need a reality check. We need a reality check in that as people in the space, either you're in development or you're working for a private sector player or whatever space you are, the reality check for me is that you need to do what you need to do as a positive change, hoping that someone else is doing something, and not get into this whirlwind of one person can change the world. And that's the mind shift that one person can change the world. And if we get it that one person can change the world, I can do what I can to change the world, hoping that another person is doing another contributory work to change the world. It allows for that freedom. Otherwise, I will always be caught in this rat race of, I need to do this, I need to do that, I need to, and that's what happens in the development sector. We want to do it all. But we need to understand the boundaries, the ecosystem boundaries of our doing, and allow for, and this is where now where you're saying we need to also bring in the interlocking aspects of and silo work, allowing myself to know that what can I do best in where I am situated. Njeri can do best in where she's situated in policy work, and therefore make all best efforts to start getting into spaces where I can give my knowledge from where I come from to those that are in that space of changing laws, regulations, and formulations. That is on one hand. The second one is on how our education system has been built up and where we need to get with it, because we are called to a specialization education system as opposed to a generalized education system. And therefore you find one is in marketing, and they will lead a marketer's life for all that their life belongs on this earth. So if we in the space start taking an individualistic perspective as practitioners, that I'm not just a scientist, I can also build into my portfolio some other few things to help me alongside the way. Because as said by you and I, we don't live a single struggle life. I will meet gaps that are science-based, but I'll also meet gaps that are cultural-based. So how do I go about it? So we can't lay all on this on our government education system. So it comes back to us, me as Njeri, as the individual. How far along am I willing to build up my portfolio, knowing that I pull my string on one end, but that string has also other strands that I need to increase on it to be able to strengthen the end. The last but not least, I think it's on the issue you've said about funding. We've for a very long time, we've funded ourselves, but then because we want to give it a high-tech proverbial name, so therefore we go for aid. We have been in this community, some of us have actually been communalized in terms of our growth. Like the community takes care of you because you also take care of the community. So because of the emergence of English and classification, we want to classify everything to a certain headline, and therefore it robs us that ability, that existence, that effort, that success that you built over time, that communities actually generate their own resources. And kind of pushing it even further along, it is to see resources, not just money. Indigenous knowledge should be seen as a very vital asset and should be in some way, if we can come up with a model that can equate it into economic monetary value, that would help us even to say that this program, the people involved in it, the community that is not, I refuse to call them target groups, I call them clients, because they are the ones who put food on my table. Without them, then I will not be in the NGO world. These clients are also bringing onto the table something that may be not physical cotton money, but they are bringing on top of what I'm bringing in terms of money, their indigenous knowledge, which is equal to this and this. So therefore, the development program is not actually 10,000 euros, it's 50,000 euros. So the match funding is in form of knowledge. I rest my case.
Could I also add something, Alex?
Feel free, the floor is yours.
Yes, well, thanks so much, Twasima, because yeah, it was great to listen to you, and you raised a lot of things, and I will only pick out one. Also, a bit the one I think that Njeri touched upon with indigenous knowledge, but also what you said, Twasima, that sometimes it seems that new concepts are introduced while they were already there in the South. Like the domestic fundraising, etc., and then taking care of each other. I think that is so key, and it's also what still surprises me, that this whole thing of sudden leadership. It seemed that it came from the north, that there was this northern rhetoric going on all the time, and still goes on, about sudden leadership. And shifting power to the south, and it's yeah, it's not, I think, the way it should be. The thing is still, and I see it still happening in a lot of northern NGOs, that the northern NGOs are so busy with thinking and making all kind of concepts, and what can we do, and what can we do, and there is just so little time for listening, and just listening what is going on and what could maybe be useful. But apparently the North is still so much in the actively trying to also to change its role without listening enough to what could be really useful. So I think that that's really a lesson that many organizations here should take into account, that they stop doing things, just listen and take a rest and lean back and see what's happening there, and then you can come in maybe. So that's my the thing I would like to add to your fantastic things that you said. Thank you.
Yes, and if I may, let me a brilliant discussion. So the conversations, as I in my previous work life, I worked.
Justice, we cannot hear you properly, I'm afraid.
Hello, can you hear me?
Now
Maybe
we
you
can
have
hear
to
you.
shout a bit. Okay.
Yes.
So it's talking about the brilliant expose by our colleague, and to say that in my previous life, I worked as a project manager for a Ghanaian-based organization, NGO, and this worked within communities to try and create some value. Almost all of our funding was from the North, but from one project to another project to another project, we actually realized how insufficient it was to rely on Northern funding as an enduring change agent in communities. And many years when I go back to those communities and you look at what I had spent a lot of my time doing, you will find out that there's literally no trace of what it is that I had done and the monies that we had gotten and how we had used it. What I find enduring and what remains to be seen has been the community's own systems, and the fact that these systems have stayed and have actually become the basis of survival for those communities. And that gives me that conversation about reimagining and getting back to say, well, at one point we had come to try and create a system. We are working together, or we are taking the leadership in providing community survival strategies and community change initiatives. But it is always important to look back and see what it is that stands the test of time. That which stands the test of time tells us that there is something valuable that can be stood up for. And that something valuable is that which we must begin to look at, how have these survived? Can we reimagine in the way that we can plug into these self-surviving and enduring, these lasting and sustainable systems that had existed over time, and therefore see how these can become the basis of which we can have a conversation. And that conversation then would allow us to imagine endless possibilities of how to lead change and development. And I think that perhaps one of the critical contributions of this book is to create these avenues for us to have the conversation again. So can we talk? Can we see what it is we've been doing? Hundreds of years of, and at some point in our lives, almost everything. And as an NGO worker at the time, I imagined that without the kind of help we got, nothing could work in communities. Those communities are existing today. They've been able to overcome their challenges and they are still existing. Of course, this is not to downplay the role that Northern civil society organizations play and the support that is got. But what it tells us is that there is more to survival, there's more to sustainability than just Northern-led developments, and which it is what we think should change, that to create opportunity for dialogue. And I think that perhaps one of the critical things this book has done is to get us around and talking and asking questions. Sometimes we may not have the answers, but that's the purpose of reimagining, to see what else it is we can do. Thank you.
Just if I may connect with that, I think it's a really great point that Justice is raising. And one of the things that, it's also a little bit raised in one of the questions in the chat, the openness to diversity, the openness to different understandings, different knowledges, but also different worldviews and faiths as a basis for whatever it is that people would like to achieve. I think that is also then one of the starting points and one of the challenges that the Northern development sector faces, how to start from this other vantage point that you may even have understand. It needs to invest in that and to recognize that these other starting points can be valid, but also to accept that diversity is a reality for you to relate to, rather than kind of neutralize and deselect because it's inconvenient. And I think that's one of the important conversations to be had the coming years.
Alex, just one more point. I'm pondering to sit here because I want to just ground back the aspect of freedom. And the thing I've seen that is like a red thread that is there in the development cooperation is the risk management factor of wanting to deal with formal groupings, formal organization. And we know that energy transformation comes from the informality of things. And therefore, it squares us back to reimagining development has to come from an informal place where we encapsulate the informality of things to allow ourselves freedom to dream, because the informal setups are where energies are developed and it is where strength is. It's not in the informal, because the informality in the global south brings with it red tape, so much systems, so much accountability. Okay, accountability is needed, but at first, when we want to drive an agenda, we need power. We need people who are really vested in it, and being vested in it will then call us to a place where we all want to run away from in terms of calculating our risk, which is the informality. And me coming from Kenya, I know the sector that drives this economy is the informal sector. There's informal sector called the Jua Kali sector. And it's where money changes hands every second. But now how to help that, to be part of the process of that sector, then I need to unlearn I need to unlearn my structural organizational thinking to be able to fit in there and have and be part of the system, get married in the system in a way that I become part of those that are working in there and those that are going to ignite the energy that is needed to help us deal with real issues, deal with real practical issues, not those high-level issues, real issues that affect a Kenyan, and a real issue that affect someone from South America, a real issue, not those high-level, so much that they become so elusive to the person for which they were meant to do good.
Anybody else wants to respond? Ask a question? Silence, good to have silence. People are thinking, perhaps a little bit tired. Siska is saying, thanks all for this honest and thought-provoking conversation. I'm looking forward to reading the book and learning more from your contributions. Here. Perhaps we can go towards the final part of the session, which is the closure. I would like to thank you all for joining us today for this book launch event. It has been an absolute pleasure to have Margit, Justice, Njeri, Tamrise, Awal, Marijke, Twasima here with us today, sharing their insights, their stories, their critical perspectives, food for thought, definitely. And I would like to ask everyone to read the book if you haven't done so already. Enjoy it and feel free to reach out to these writers, but also to the other writers, which you can find in the book. I'm sure you can find them online via LinkedIn, and otherwise you can always send a message to Pythos, and we are happy to connect you with the individuals that you're looking for. For now, I would say thanks again, and see you next time.